Scooby-Dooby-Doo, where are you? We got some work to do.
Hey everyone, it's Tim from Geek Branch, and with the recent release of Scoob, a question came to my mind. Why has Scooby-Doo stood the test of time? What made Scooby-Doo different from hundreds of other Hanna-Barbera cartoons? Why did they decide for Scooby-Doo to be the icon to start a new Hanna-Barbera universe? At one time, it was Yogi Bear that was meant to be the icon to bear the mantle for Hanna-Barbera as its cartoon mascot. But which cartoon do you see or hear more about? Well, Scooby-Doo. So let's figure out why. Let's break down the history of how Scooby-Doo and Mystery Inc. came to be first. Let's figure out why it became an instant hit. Scooby-Doo, Where Are You? Was a series that was created during a time of various societal changes. And there was one thing in particular that directly affected the fate of our favorite meddling kids. And believe it or not, it was the assassination of one Robert F. Kennedy. Did you know in the late 1960s, the television and film studio Hanna-Barbera was an empire? It became the biggest producer of animated television and programming, and for the longest time, Hanna-Barbera was known for its staple cartoons, whether it was Tom and Jerry, the Flintstones, and of course the Yogi Bear Show. But by the 1960s, those shows weren't popular anymore. Instead, the focus was on shows that was about secret agents and the space race craze. See, this was during a time where there was multiple live-action shows like Get Smart, or Mission Impossible, or most notably, a show called Danger Man. You might not remember this name because it later changed to Secret Agent. The reason for that is because when they released the show, it was a dud. But when they released it as Secret Agent, the show had a new theme song, Secret Agent Man by Johnny Rivers. And of course, this song is very iconic. We've heard it in different TV shows and movies, and that show really kickstarted the Secret Agent craze. And so Hanna-Barbera, of course, during this time, came up with Secret Squirrel, just in perfect timing for that craze. And then there was also the space race phase, with America and Russia trying to rush and become the first ones to land on the moon. Everybody was involved in this during this time. And of course, Hanna-Barbera had to react quickly, with multiple sci-fi shows such as Space Ghost, Galaxy Trio, and the Herculoids. So with that all in mind, and what would serve as a turning point in television animation, the three broadcast networks, CBS, ABC, and NBC, launched 9 new action-adventure cartoons on Saturday morning in the fall of 1966. Hanna-Barbera's Space Ghost and Dino Boy was a hit with the kids. Other action-adventure series during these times, along with Space Ghost and Dino Boy, were considered non-stop action and violence, with the heroes working to defeat and sometimes even kill the bad guy. A lot of parents noticed this, and they said that it was no longer a focus on the funny human and animal hijinks they grew up with, and instead it was about people in terror, peril, or jeopardy, and sometimes even child endangerment. See, during all this, the networks had instructed the cartoon suppliers to churn out more of the same, in fact go stronger, on the theory which they had proved correctly that the more horror, the higher the Saturday morning ratings. Kids loved these shows. I know for a fact many of us kids that grew up in the 90s watched a lot of these. One in particular for myself was Johnny Quest. Absolute blast of a show, and I would watch it again. Well, with that, such horror generally took the form of fantasy violence. This is what they considered back in the 1960s. And what Joe Barbera had to say about this, he said it was out of this world hard action. The studio churned out these grim series not out of choice, Barbera explained. It was the only thing we could sell to the networks, and we had to stay in business. Barbera's remarks highlighted the immense authority then held by the broadcast networks in dictating the content of Saturday morning television. The decline in regulation of children's television spurred criticism over violence, commercialism, and the lack of diversity in children's programming. The nonprofit corporation National Association for Better Broadcasting declared that year's children's television programming in 1968 to be the worst in the history of television. You see, there was a lot of cultural anxieties during the late 1960s. When it came to the effects of media violence on children, it was said that it was increased significantly after March of 1968. And this was all because of television coverage that had to do with the Vietnam War, student protests, and riots incited by the assassination of MLK Jr. This pivotal year caused an upheaval fueled by moral crusades. Everybody was so focused on the war, focused on what happened to Martin Luther King Jr., it directly affected how the course of television was brought. But one thing in particular really affected this. It all came to a head when the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy had occurred. It happened on June 1968. This would cause the exile of action-adventure cartoons. This would occur for nearly a decade. You see, Kennedy was a father to 11 kids, and that often affected his political identity. Most people knew him as a family man, and because of that, he was known as a champion for causes that help children. Alongside his commitment to ending children hunger and poverty, he had worked with the Federal Communications Commission to improve what was considered at the time a vast wasteland of children's television programming. Merely hours after Kennedy was shot, President Lyndon B. Johnson announced the appointment of the National Commission on the Causes and Prevention of Violence. While the commission's formal findings won't be shared until late 1969, the demands for greater social control and regulation of media violence surged directly following Johnson's announcement, contributing to what socialists called a moral panic. So the moral panic in the summer of 1968 actually caused permanent damage in the landscape of Saturday morning cartoons. The networks announced that they would be turning away from science fiction adventures and pivoting towards comedy for its cartoon programming. However, the premiere of 1968 through 1969 Saturday morning season was just around the corner. So with that all just around the corner, many episodes of new action-adventure series were still in various stages of production. See, with this, the animation was the lengthy process. Even with Hanna-Barbera's known shortcuts with their animation, it still took anywhere from 4 to 6 months to go from idea to airing. ABC, CBS, and NBC stood to lose millions of dollars in licensing fees and advertisement revenue by just canceling a series before it even aired, or before it finished its contracted run. So in 1968, several parent-run organizations made this situation worse. Most notably, Action for Children's Television, known as ACT. They began to vocally protest what they perceived as an excessive amount of gratuitous violence in Saturday morning cartoons. And most of these shows were Hanna-Barbera action shows, such as I mentioned before, my beloved Johnny Quest, and then of course, Space Ghost and the Herculoids. And virtually all of them were canceled by 1969 because of the pressure from these parent groups. Members of these watch groups or parent groups served later as advisors to Hanna-Barbera and other animation studios to ensure that their new programs would be safe for children. And with all of this going on, due to the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy, this paved the way for the creation of a goofier, gentler, groovier animated hero known as Scooby-Doo.
Turn it up, will ya?
In 1968, the man in charge of children's programming for the CBS network, Fred Silverman, began looking for a show that would revitalize his Saturday morning lineup and please the watchdog groups at the same time. The result was The Archie Show. Yes, the same Archie from Archie Comics that was created by Bob Montana. You see, at the end of every episode, the Archies would perform a song, and with that, one particular song, Sugar Sugar, was extremely successful, so much so in fact it became the #1 hit for Billboard Records in 1969. So with that success, Silverman was eager to expand upon this, so he contacted producers William Hanna and Joseph Barbera about possibly creating another show based around a teenage rock group. But with this, there was an extra element. The kids would solve mysteries in between their gigs. Hanna-Barbera passed the task of the new show requested by Fred Silverman to two of their head storymen, Joe Ruby and Ken Spears. They actually co-created many other shows, such as one known as Jabberjaws. Yes, the bad knockoff of Scooby-Doo. The same people who made Scooby-Doo made knockoffs of Scooby-Doo that just didn't work the same. They also worked alongside legendary character designer Iowa Takamoto. The original concept of their show had the title Mysteries 5, and it featured 5 teens, Jeff, Mike, Kelly, and Linda's brother, WW, alongside their dog, Too Much, who were all in a band together called the Mysteries 5. Even the dog, he played the bongos. When the Mysteries 5 weren't performing at gigs, they were out solving spooky mysteries involving ghosts, zombies, and other supernatural creatures. Ruby and Spears had to decide what to make their dog. At first, they chose between a large cowardly dog and a small feisty dog. When the former was chosen, then the options became a large goofy Great Dane or a big shaggy sheepdog. After consulting with Barbera on the issue, Too Much was finally set as a Great Dane, primarily to avoid a direct correlation to the Archies, who had a sheepdog, Hot Dog, in their band. So Ruby's and Spears feared that the Great Dane would be too much like the comic strip character, Marmaduke, but Barbera assured them it would not be a problem. Takamoto consulted a studio colleague who happened to be a breeder of Great Danes, and after learning the characteristics of the prize-winning Great Dane, Takamoto proceeded to break most of the rules and design Too Much with overly bowed legs, a double chin, a slop back, and many other abnormalities that we know Scooby-Doo for. By the time the show was ready for presentation by Silverman, a few more things had changed. Jeff and Mike were merged into one character called Ronnie, later renamed Fred at Silverman's behest. I guess he wanted one character named after him. And then Kelly was renamed to Daphne. Linda was now called Velma, and Shaggy, formerly WW, was no longer Velma's brother, which would have been totally awkward if that was still the case, because in Mysteries Incorporated, way down the road, they become boyfriend and girlfriend. And to no one's surprise, Scooby wasn't really cool with that. Anyways, Silverman, not being very fond of the name Mysteries 5, had renamed the show Who's Sissa Scared, using storyboards, presentation boards, and a short completed animated sequence. Silverman presented Who's Sissa Scared to the CBS executives as the centerpiece for the upcoming 1969-1970 season's Saturday morning cartoon block. The executives felt the show's presentation artwork was far too frightening for young viewers, and thinking the show would be the same, decided to pass on it. Now, without a centerpiece for the upcoming season's programming, Silverman, after catching a red eye, turned to Ruby and Spears, who reworked the show to make it a more comedic and less frightening show. They dropped the rock band element and began to focus more attention on Shaggy and Too Much. According to Ruby and Spears, Silverman was inspired by the ad-lib "Dooby Dooby Doo" that he heard at the end of Frank Sinatra's interpretation of Strangers in the Night. And this was on the way out of one of their meetings, and decided to rename the dog and rename the show Scooby-Doo. Scooby-Doo, Where Are You? A revised show was represented to the CBS executives, who then approved for its production. Since the beginning of the inception of this show, Silverman envisioned the show as a cross between the popular I Love a Mystery radio serials of the 1940s and the popular early 1960s TV shows of Dobie Gillis. Many Loves of Dobie Gillis aired on CBS during 1959 to 1963. Dobie Gillis was an ordinary high school student who wanted the simple things in life: money, respect, and the love of beautiful women. His best friend was an oddball beatnik named Maynard G. Krebs. Maynard G. Krebs was played by Bob Denver, also known for his iconic character Gilligan from Gilligan's Island. Maynard was known as a character that had a goatee, who was allergic to work, and said the word like a lot. Sound familiar? While Dobie found himself pursuing beautiful women who were rarely interested in him, while his childhood friend Zelda Gilroy insisted she was destined to be his ultimate match. It broke a lot of new ground for TV, being one of the first shows to have the characters comment directly to the audience, breaking the fourth wall. The first series to ever have teenagers as the leads of the show, as well as one of the TV's first countercultural characters. This was, of course, Maynard. He was a beatnik. That wasn't very common back then to have characters like that on a TV show. Most time it was clean cut, leave it to Beaver type stuff, and then they kind of broke the ground for these new type of sitcoms. It was also much more slyly scripted than a lot of the more dated shows of the era. It was noted for its rapid-fire dialogue exchanges. So the influence of I Love a Mystery and Dobie Gillis were especially apparent in these early episodes. Mark Evener, who would write Scooby-Doo teleplays and comic book scripts in the 1970s and 1980s, identified each of the four teenagers with their corresponding Dobie Gillis character. Fred was clearly based on Dobie, Velma on Zelda, Daphne on Talia, and Shaggy on Maynard. Similarities between Shaggy and Maynard are the most noticeable. Both characters shared the same beatnik-style goatee, similar hairstyles, and demeanors. The roles of each character are also strongly defined in the series. Fred is the leader and the determined detective, Velma is the intelligent analyst, Daphne is the danger-prone, damsel in distress, vain type, while Shaggy and Scooby are the cowardly types more motivated by hunger than any desire to solve mysteries. Later versions, of course, of the show would make slight changes to the characters' established roles. Most of all, you would see a lot of changes with Daphne. In the 1990s and the 2000s, you would see Daphne take on many forms of karate, being able to finally defend herself and not be a damsel in distress. Anyways, the plot of each Scooby-Doo episode in the early days followed a formula that would serve as a template for many of the later incarnations of the series. At the beginning of the episode, the Mystery Inc. gang would bump into some type of evil ghost or monsters, which they would learn had been terrorizing the locals. The teens usually offered to help solve the mystery behind the creature, and while looking for clues and suspects, the gang would run into the monster. And of course, the monster would chase after them. It was usually Scooby and Shaggy that would run into the monsters first, of course. However, after analyzing the clues that they had found, the gang determines that this monster is simply a mere mortal, usually some old man or something, and they would eventually capture said monster and have the criminal behind the mask or costume arrested. At this point, the criminal would utter their famous catchphrase, "I would have gotten away with it too if it wasn't for you meddling kids." Scooby-Doo, Where Are You? Still supplies a dose of action and adventure, but the characters are never in real peril or face serious jeopardy. There are no superheroes saving the world from aliens or monsters. Instead, it's a gang of goofy kids and their dog in a groovy van solving mysteries. The monsters they encounter are just humans in disguise. But of course, a lot could be said about them unmasking monsters and turning out to be human. We'll go over this more in the second video where I discuss about why Scooby-Doo is still popular to this day. But in the meantime, share in your comments your favorite memories of Scooby-Doo. Tell me your favorite TV show, iteration, or your favorite movie, whereas most people probably will say Zombie Island, which is awesome, and that's probably my favorite. Probably my second favorite would have to be Cyber Chase. I was probably about 10 years old when that came out, so I even had their really terrible video game, but with being 10 years old, I absolutely loved it. I've been a big fan of Scooby-Doo since I was a little kid. I didn't say this at the beginning of the episode, but I was that kid that would have his room just completely decorated in Scooby-Doo. I remember even going to the zoo to take a picture with Scooby and Shaggy. Again, I was probably like 8 or 10, but they were a big part of my life, so once Scoob came out, I just felt like this was a perfect opportunity for me to jump into and remember what exactly it was about Scooby-Doo that made me love it. And the further I digged into it, the more I found out about the history of Scooby-Doo. There's many other videos that discuss about the history of Scooby-Doo, but I kind of wanted to do my own take on it. So I really hope y'all enjoyed watching and listening. And as I always say, thank you for letting me get to the root of my geek culture. with you.
Look, Scoob, you've been turned to stone. Wait a minute. Scooby, you're all right.